Hello, everybody. My name is Cheryl. For those of you who don't know me, I am the digital organizer at the Australian Democracy Network, and I'm working on the Our Democracy campaign. Welcome to everyone joining us tonight. It's great to see all of you. I'm always so excited for these webinars because, I feel like I'm always writing emails to you, but on these webinars, I actually get to see your faces. So thanks for joining us. Let's begin by acknowledging that wherever we're calling from, we are calling from First Nations land and that sovereignty has never been ceded. I'm on the traditional lands of the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, and I pay my respects to elders past, present, and extend that respect to any Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islander people joining us tonight. And tonight we are here to talk about democracy, and in doing so, I want to acknowledge that First Nations people have been governing on this land for time immemorial, and that under their governance, our land and our waters thrived. And I also acknowledge that our democratic system has caused immense suffering and damage to First Nations people, to First Nations culture, and to country, and that we cannot achieve a healthy democracy without justice and self-determination for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders peoples. I would like to invite you all to say hello and share the country that you're calling in from in the chat. And if you are unsure, Ash is going to kindly share a link to help you find out. Thank you, Ash. Okay, so a little bit of context for tonight. Welcome to Living Democracy. It is the third webinar of the Our Democracy Deep Dive series. Tonight's event is hosted by the Our Democracy campaign. So we are a nationwide movement of people and organisations who are speaking up for an end to corporate influence in our democracy. We're working towards a shared vision of a political system where our elected representatives truly reflect the values and concerns of our communities, and where decision making is balanced and fair, and with people and the planet at the heart of it. A little bit of an agenda and housekeeping check for tonight. Tonight we are in conversation with our guest speaker, Tim Hollo. I'll be facilitating the discussion based on the really great questions that you've provided in the RSVP process. So thank you very much for sharing your thoughts. We've divided this event into 3 sections. So firstly, we'll hear from Tim about his new book and explore the themes and ideas from it. And then we'll jump into some breakout rooms so that you can brainstorm some ways to apply some of these principles and ideas in your own everyday lives. And then we'll come back as a group to hear more from Tim about some case studies and think about what's next as we build a powerful movement for a fair and healthy democracy. In terms of housekeeping, we absolutely love how engaged and enthusiastic our community is, but especially while Tim is speaking, let's try and keep the chat really focus on the content of the webinar, as it can be a little bit distracting for people. And if you do need closed captions, you can turn them on with the button at the bottom of your screen. There's a button that says CC Show Captions. You just click that and that will turn it on for you. And Ash will also share some instructions as well. Great to see everybody checking in and saying hello and sharing what country they are calling from. Okay, so without further ado, I'm really excited to introduce our guest speaker tonight, Tim Hollo. So Tim wears many different hats. He is a highly regarded environmentalist, community builder, and musician. He is the executive director of the Green Institute, founder of Green Music Australia. He's also established Canberra's Buy Nothing groups. He's set up a community library and spearheaded a campaign to keep billboard advertising out of the city. But not only that, somehow between all these incredible jobs and projects, he's managed to write a book, and it's called Living Democracy, an Ecological Manifesto for the End of the World as We Know It. And the ideas and themes in this book will shape much of our discussion tonight. So, Tim, I imagine that writing a book isn't, the easiest thing to do, especially on such a dense topic like democracy. So I wanted to know what motivated you to write a book like this.
Thanks so much, Cheryl. Thank you so much to Our Democracy for having me. it's really fantastic to be here to be part of this conversation. I want to, before I get to your question, acknowledge that I'm joining tonight from the land of the Ngunnawal and the Ngambri people in Canberra, and the vast bulk of this book was written on the lands of the Ngunnawal and Ngambri people, and a chunk of it on the lands of the Garigu people, whose land is behind me in my background, my favourite part of this magnificent continent up in the high country. A number of things motivated me to write this book. I guess what really led me down the path of thinking about these issues was many, many years, a couple of decades and a bit, working for change in various spaces, mostly over most of that period as an environmental activist and a climate change activist in various ways, working in policy development, working in campaigning and communications, doing direct actions with Greenpeace, working at the political coalface, as it were, as a staffer at Parliament House with Christine Milne for many years. Kind of all of these different approaches to try to get the action that we need. And finding that the system was not letting us get the change that we needed in so many ways. And I guess what really led me to start questioning very deeply how these things are happening was having the extraordinary privilege to be part of the negotiation process with the Multi-Party Climate Change Committee that led to the adoption of Australia's world-leading, at the time, climate policies with our carbon price and the Clean Energy Finance Corporation and all of these things. And then a couple of years later, seeing many of those things torn down. And really that kind of gave me a lot of pause for thought to think about, really deeply about what's going on. So I started doing a lot of research and in literature, but also in talking to people around the place about how we think change happens in various ways. So I was already doing that thinking when a couple of years ago, my younger kid got heavily involved in the school strike movement. And they got deeply involved, and they were, in fact, leading the organising and emceeing the rally at the end of 2019, which you may remember, many of you, the massive rallies around the country. Here in Canberra, we had 15,000 people on the streets, which for a city of 400,000 is absolutely astronomical. So anyway, yeah, my kid was emceeing that rally, and there was this great momentum. It was fantastic. It felt amazing. And then the Prime Minister told everyone to go back to school, go home and be quiet. And everyone went home. And so I was kind of sitting with my own kid and various of the others, kind of as they were scratching their heads going, what on earth just happened? And we thought that if we built a movement and people came, then we'd get the wins. And so that led to a whole lot of other really interesting conversations around, okay, well, how does change actually happen? Can we believe really that our political system as it is currently structured is going to deliver the changes, even if we do build the movements? And what's going on? Is it just the donations? Is it corruption? Is it this? Is it that? And really, that's kind of what led me to question these whole conversations around this idea that democracy is the best, is that democracy is the worst option except for all of the others, as people say, but that really disguises the fact that there are numerous different forms of democracy. And do we in fact have the only kind of democracy that's possible? Are there other ways of doing democracy that might be more effective, that might be more democratic? And that's really what this book is trying to explore.
Thanks, Tim. And I think the reason why so many people are interested in coming tonight is understanding and thinking about different ways of doing democracy, and you explore that deeply in your book. So can you tell us briefly about what your book is about and what you hope for people to get out of it?
What I really hope for people to get out of it is some inspiration to get involved in all sorts of different ways to help deepen our democracy as much as we possibly can, and in our own daily lives, in our own communities, and extending that then into the way our democratic systems work in all sorts of ways. The idea behind the title, Living Democracy, is that our democratic systems have been deadened in so many ways by being made exclusive, shutting people out of the democratic process a lot of the time. We're finding that advocacy is being suppressed, is being shut down, protest is being shut down, is being made illegal a lot of the time. We're told that democracy is about rocking up to vote for the least worst option once every few years and then, get stuffed, go away, let us do our job. Whereas I think we really need to embrace an idea of democracy as a living thing, as the living extension, really, of our human superorganism, in a sense. That democracy should be everything about the way we live our lives together, co-creating our common future. Democracy isn't just politics. It isn't just representative democracy. It's not just parliaments. It's not just policy setting. Democracy simply means people power. It simply means how the people come together in various ways to make decisions communally about our common future. And that can be anything from buy nothing groups where we negotiate space essentially between us to share goods and services that we might have. It could be school PNCs. It can be community gardens, again, where we're negotiating space. It can be more formal community assemblies in all sorts of ways in our communities. It can be essentially anything that we do together to develop paths into the future together. And I think as we come to understand democracy in that way, and as we practice it in living ways, that's the flip side of the living democracy idea, is that we need to see living democracy as a verb. It's how we live our democracy together that will determine how it actually then starts to institutionalize in different ways.
Thanks, Tim. I also love what you said about democracy means people power. For so much of us, it's, the way we see democracy is just going to vote every few years. But in your book, you really explain how it's a living extension of all the things and interactions that we have between our communities and between each other. And you talk about this idea and this goal of a living democracy that will be able to rise up to the challenges that we face, climate change, a pandemic, racial and social injustice. Can you explain a little bit more deeply? I know you've gone into it a little bit, but can you explain that concept of the living democracy a little bit more? And then could you give us a couple more starting points for people to think about how they might embody these ideas in their own everyday lives? I know you mentioned buy nothing groups. Could you go into that a little bit more?
Sure, yeah. So yeah, the path to finding the words living democracy came very much from exploring it in terms of an ecological approach to politics. So thinking through, that's the subtitle being an ecological manifesto for the end of the world as we know it, kind of going, it's really easy to look around the world today and being really confronted with everything. But it doesn't have to be the end of the world. It does have to be the end of the world as we know it. And the way we can shift things is if we start to embrace an understanding of the world which is much more ecological, which embraces the ecological, the fundamentals of ecosystems, which are diversity, interdependence, and impermanence. That is how all ecosystems work. The health of ecosystems and all of the members of ecosystems is always dependent on the diversity of different species and subspecies in that ecosystem and the interdependence, the interconnection between them. And so that's really where the phrase living democracy comes from for me. It's understanding that the way we need to do democracy has to develop out of living systems, has to develop out of that understanding of interdependence and diversity, and be done in all sorts of different ways through that. So it understands the living world and grows out of the living world and the health of the living world. So in that way, then, what you get from the idea of living democracy is that we can't let democracy just be politics. We can't let democracy just be parliaments. It needs to be overlapping systems in all of our lives in all sorts of different ways that we get ourselves involved in, dig deep and get our hands dirty in all sorts of ways. One of the things for me thinking through is that families are democratic systems, or should be, really. And I think they increasingly are. We've moved out of that kind of reasonably brief period of history, I think, in many ways, where families were autocracies, into a period where all the members of families actually do get to sit down together and discuss plans in various ways. Our workplaces should be more democratic. That's a really central part of this idea, is that the system of workplaces being incredibly hierarchical, and workers doing what they're told to by bosses who then basically cream off the profits, and workers a lot of the time don't get to share in the benefits of what they create, needs to shift towards a model more like, for instance, worker cooperatives and user cooperatives, where everybody who's involved gets to have a say, gets to have some agency in what they're doing. And as we build that, I think we'll find that we can start to actually transform the way we do capital D democracy too. The way we do politics actually will begin to transform as we practice this living process. So yeah, I guess, cooperatives is an interesting example, whereby, we can shift, and there've been really amazing examples all over the world of hierarchical for-profit corporations which get taken over by their workers, and their workers then get to make collectively the decisions about how the work gets done. One of the really amazing examples of that, actually, in Australia, that I tell in my book, is about how about halfway through the building of the Sydney Opera House, there was a stop work that was put in place because of the poor treatment of a number of workers. But the workers really wanted the work to get done. They wanted the Opera House to be built. And so they did a reverse picket. Instead of stopping people from coming in, they all went in and they locked the gates, and they locked the managers out, and they collectively set up the process for continuing the work in a much more flat, democratic manner. And in fact, got the work done so much more efficiently and so much faster than before, that the owners had no alternative, basically, but to give in to their requests and say, yep, you can have higher pay, shorter hours, more control over what you're doing because you're doing a good job. And the same thing tends to happen in so many different ways. When we organise in our communities together democratically, things work well. Whether it be you're building deeper community cohesion and nicer neighbourhoods to live in, if you're doing this kind of process with Buy Nothing groups and community gardens and community groups looking after green spaces and sharing across houses and apartments so that you know your neighbours more, and all of these kinds of things, building connection, explicitly kind of, collectively understanding ourselves as needing to come together to co-determine our common future in all sorts of ways.
For sure. And I love that anecdote about the Sydney Opera House. It's just such a representation of how the power is in the people. And you talked about, organising our communities so that things do run well. What are some of the ways that you've seen communities do that? And what kind of transformation did you see come from these kind of organising and organising, like these communities organising together to get better outcomes for each other?
There's so many examples around the place. I think one of the ones that many of us are probably quite aware of, I suspect that everybody who's here today is aware of the Voices for Indi, and what they've done in the electorate of Indi in Northern Victoria. What people aren't necessarily aware of, although I suspect many of you are, is that didn't start as an electoral project at all. They didn't actually start that as, with the goal of getting somebody elected to Parliament. That was a group of people who started saying, we don't think our representative is really representing the views of this community very well. And what we're going to do is start a process of kitchen table conversations where we really build a deeper understanding amongst ourselves of what the values of this community are. And we're going to then take that to our member and say, we think that you should act on this kind of value set. And they really did that in an extraordinarily consultative and deep manner, where literally kitchen table by kitchen table, 6 and 8 people at a time around the electorate, building up into their thousands and thousands, came together to develop this kind of shared platform that they all believed in. And it was, a really intense process of conversation that led them to that point. They took it to their local member. Their local member kind of quite literally booted them out of the office and said, I'm not interested in that. That's not actually what my voters believe. And so that's when they said, we reckon we should probably run for election. And it took quite a long process again after that, deep consultation to work out if they should in fact run for election, and then if they were going to, how that campaign would run, and finally who should be the candidate. And they found themselves elected. And once elected, Cathy McGowan did an extraordinary job of rotating members of the community through her office so that she was constantly, being kept connected to the community, so that as a member of the federal parliament, she was very, very much there. And Helen Haynes, having replaced her, continues to be very, very much there as a delegate for the community, not for for anything other than what the community tell her that they want. And she continues to kind of negotiate these processes along the way. And so I think that's a really amazing example of a kind of a deep connection process in communities. People finding common purpose, common ground, often across quite dramatic difference in personal circumstances, in political views, but through the process of deliberative democracy, of kitchen table conversations, finding common ground, and then getting elected to Parliament and continuing to behave in Parliament in a different way, in such a way that then inspires others to follow suit. So I think that's a really great example of how you can do this grassroots organising to have a really big impact on capital P politics as well.
Thanks, Tim. What about for people in their own everyday lives? What can they begin to do to extend democracy beyond, just voting? What's something they could do tomorrow or, the next week with their neighbours or with their families to start living democracy?
Anything at all, as long as it's together, is my glib answer to that. But there's so many things going on, and I've no doubt that pretty much everyone here is involved in probably half a dozen different ways in things that I would consider to be living democracy. It might be a book club, it might be or a reading group, it might be a cooking club, or a crafting group. It might be a lobbying organisation. It might be a kitchen garden. It might be a community club of some kind. I guess, I think so many people are already doing these things. What I ask people to do through living democracy is to really deeply understand those more as actually democratic engagement, and to think of them as such. And I think it's that process of thinking them differently which helps them become really transformative and democratic. One of the things I often think about is, you mentioned, Cheryl, that I set up the Buy Nothing groups here in Canberra. And it's a Facebook-based sharing system, essentially, where, and it's hyper-local. It's suburb-based and sometimes smaller than suburb-based, so that you get to know your neighbours as you're giving away things and asking for things from people, whether it's borrowing a cup of sugar or a lawnmower that circulates around the community, or we have in mind 2 suitcases of clothes that constantly cycle through the community of people kind of picking things up and putting them in. I saw a piano being given away quite recently on our Buy Nothing group. What I find fun with that is that just numerous people from all walks of life and different perspectives join those Buy Nothing groups. And every now and then I kind of stir the pot by making a comment about how what we're doing is actually radical anti-capitalist organizing. And the response that I often get is, no, what are you talking about? Of course oh, yeah, actually it is. And, people don't realize that by sharing things, giving things away, asking for things free and accepting them free and building these community connections as they're doing it, they're really fundamentally withdrawing consent from the capitalist system, which says that everything is financially transactionable. So, yeah, the reason I tell that story in this context is that I think by understanding all of the things that we're doing in the community as democratic participation and as transformative to our democracy by getting people involved, and by starting to talk to each other as though that's the case, we live that world into being and we become transformative. So, yeah, I think it's hard to tell people what to do because I think people are already doing these things. It's more about thinking about how it is that we're doing them and what that means. Does that make sense?
Yeah, absolutely. That makes sense. I'm personally a very big fan of my local Good Karma network.
Yeah, cool.
I mean, just the other day I put out a request of like, does anyone have this book that I'm wanting to read? And I got a flood of like people being like, yep, you can have it, you can borrow it. It's just like, oh, I actually don't need to pay for something like that. And I can give away things that I don't need. So big fan of that. So Tim has given us some really excellent ideas about what we can do in our own lives to extend democracy beyond, politics, and think of every facet of our lives as an extension of democracy. Now I would like all of us to have a think about some of these ideas and then break out into smaller groups for about, let's say 12 minutes as we're running a little bit over. Have a discussion and a brainstorm about some of the things that you can do in your everyday lives and communities to build this kind of participation. So maybe it could be, something like a Buy Nothing group, or maybe it's like a community fruit and vegetable swap, or maybe as a skill that you could share with your community, or maybe there are things that you're already doing. Share that with the group that you break out into. Welcome back. Thank you everyone for those great breakout room sessions. In the room that I popped into, I heard some really good stories about, kitchen table conversations. I heard a really great story about food co-ops. And I'm certainly feeling really inspired by all these creative and community-minded people on this call with us tonight. I would also like to hear from everyone. Were there any ideas that stood out for you? Was there anything that resonated? Were there any ideas that you were thinking, oh, maybe I'll start implementing that in my life? I would love to hear from everyone. So if you could pop in the chat, one or two of the favorite things that you heard in your groups, what resonated with you, just pop it in the chat. Thank you. Tim, was there anything that you heard in your group?
Yeah, there were a bunch of things, lots of great examples. There are a couple of things that really jumped out at me. One was a conversation about scale of community and the joy of kind of living in more human scale community in a sense, and understanding it that way, which I think is crucial. But it's also really crucial, of course, to understand how we link up our communities of scale so that it's more connected and cosmopolitan. Another thing that I heard, which goes to one of the questions that was asked in the chat before, was a discussion about the importance of facilitators and a facilitators network. But good conversations.
And that is a great segue. We're going to jump into a bit more of a discussion with you. I know a lot of people, it's certainly my experience, are really put off by politics. Just talking about it can be very polarizing. You don't bring it up at the dinner table. You certainly don't bring it up at Christmas because it inevitably leads to fighting. But in your book, you have a great section about, changing the way that we disagree and facilitating those really difficult conversations. And you talk about how important it is for us to actually disagree with one another. And firstly, can you tell us why in a healthy democracy it's important, this kind of vigorous disagreement? Why is it important? And then secondly, how do we facilitate those kind of conversations with people that we disagree with?
So disagreement is important because it's real, is the most fundamental point to me. We're never going to have everybody agreeing about anything, and that's reality, and that's a great thing, actually. As I was saying before, this view of politics kind of derives from an understanding of ecology, and crucial to ecology is diversity. Diversity of opinion is a crucial part of diversity in ecology, and we need to learn how to manage difference and converse and discuss across difference rather than try to erase difference. And I think that's a really, really important lesson in politics. So much of our politics is either really adversarial, where we're trying to defeat the other side's opinion, or it's kind of saying, well, discussion is scary, it's too hard, so we need to kind of come into a comfortable middle, this idea of sensible centrism. We need to find a comfortable middle where we're not disagreeing anymore, and that's the good place to be. Actually, what we need is good ways of disagreeing comfortably so that we can bring different opinions to the table and find creative solutions. And that is the skill of facilitation, which I think is going to be so crucial to kind of any, more effective and more healthy form of democracy. It's really remarkable how if you bring people into a room and you kind of say your team A and your team B, or your team coal miners and your team climate action, or your team loggers and your team conservationists, or your team unionists and workers and your team bosses, you get a fight, and it's really difficult to find any kind of compromise because you've set it up in such a way that people don't want to compromise. You've set it up in such a way that people want to actually win an argument. Whereas if you set up a conversation, you bring people into a room together and you say, hello, we're all from this part of the world. We share all sorts of common interests. Let's sit down together and talk first about what we've got in common. What's this community got going for it? What do we share? How do we form a team together? And then, okay, so what are the different things that we're bringing to the table here? Yes, we disagree. Of course we disagree because we're humans and we've got different opinions. What are we bringing to the table differently? And let's talk about that openly. And can we think of creative solutions? And that's the other really important thing about disagreeing differently, I think, is when we disagree in this adversarial manner, as I say, compromise is difficult, but compromise also becomes a linear thing, that it's give and take somewhere along a continuum between side A and side B. So you might get a compromise on climate targets that's somewhere between what the science demands and what the coal companies want. And that's not going to be a good solution. Whereas if you come at it from a more deliberative perspective, rather than a compromise, you can actually come up with creative, interesting solutions that people hadn't necessarily thought of before, that satisfy everyone, actually, that do satisfy what the climate demands and what the coal miners need. So that's, I think the crucial lesson for disagreeing differently.
Thanks, Tim. And you're so right. It's about finding common values, common purpose, because we do have so much in common with each other. And I have a question. I think it links up with some of the questions in the chat. But it feels like, there is a big gap between, where we want to be, where we want our goal of a living democracy, it's a vision of an integrative, cooperative and participatory democracy. And there's a big gap between that and our system at present. And you talked about, I think someone said in the comments here, like if we were already doing these things, how haven't we overthrown the system and changed and created this system that we do want to be living? So what are the reasons why we aren't there yet? And what are the most powerful things that our community can do to begin our process to get us there towards that shared vision?
Yeah, thanks for bringing up that question, because it was a really good one in the comments. Thanks, Lou. So my short answer to the question is power. The systems of power that have been built up around capitalism, around the top-down hierarchical democratic systems that we have, are very, very deeply entrenched, and they're going to be very, very hard to shift. So yeah, by saying kind of all we need to do is this community level action, I'm not trying to say that's easy and that it's going to work really, really quickly. I guess what I'm saying is that if we continue to operate within these systems and kind of try to get change within the systems, we definitely won't change them, because what we're doing by working in that way is buttressing these hierarchical power-based systems. If we start to rebuild new ones from the grassroots up, then we have a greater chance of replacing the systems. What I do in part 3 of the book is kind of try to piece together an idea of how transformational change can happen, learning from ecosystems. So it learns particularly from the theory of panarchy, the ecological theory of panarchy, which is about how all systems go through this cycle of change, which is about growth and conservation and collapse and reorganization in a new form. And that systems work by kind of all of these layers, these cycles working in layers and scales in all sorts of ways. And usually that kind of buttresses itself to create a whole lot of stability, but sometimes you reach points where a whole lot of these layers, these cycles, are reaching collapse and reorganization at the same time. And certainly I'm not the only one who's looking around the world today and seeing the collapse in confidence in democratic systems, the collapse in confidence in capitalist systems, the collapse in confidence in markets being the appropriate way to share important goods like energy and housing and food, all of these kinds of things, and seeing that we look like we might be heading for a point of reorganization, actually, in all sorts of interesting ways. So what I think needs to be done is that as we live into being in our own communities, in our own lives, these new ways of being, or in fact reinventing these very, very ancient ways of being, what we also need to do is along the way really explicitly and deliberately actually withdraw our consent from the existing systems. So I mentioned earlier how I think involvement in the buy nothing groups is withdrawing consent from the market. And I think it is, but it needs to be more explicitly so. And there are other things too along that level. So for instance, I think what Voices for Indi did was withdraw consent from the major party system and say, we don't believe in that anymore. We're going to start to change it by changing it ourselves. What we do with things like community gardens, I think, are a really important example of that. Community food gardens, where, yes, it's just enjoyable actually to grow food. It's something that a lot of people love doing. It's healthy, but also it's actually withdrawing consent from the capitalist food system and saying we don't want to have to always go to a supermarket to feed ourselves. We want to be able to self-provision, and we want to do that for our communities. And so as we start to do these things in our communities, we have to be always saying, we're not just doing this as an add-on. We're not just doing this as a fun little thing to have on the side. We're doing this because it's transformational. And once we explicitly start saying that and doing it, it starts to become more transformational. And then we tie it together with the other things that we're doing. And that's, I think, one of the things that I didn't mention in the first bit that I really wanted to highlight now is if we're doing all of these things separately, then they won't be transformative. But if we start to piece together in our communities, we've got Buy Nothing groups and gardens and citizens assemblies and school P&Cs and workers co-ops and food co-ops, and we join the dots together, we're creating a new interconnected ecosystem of democracy. And it's as we develop that ecosystem that meshes together, that is also withdrawing consent from the old ways of doing things, then we start to get to a point where it can become transformative.
And you talked about withdrawing consent and rebuilding power. And a question that came up a lot from our community was, where are some of these places that have withdrawn their consent from the status quo? Where have they been able to rebuild power to create this living participatory democracy? You talked about Voices for Indi. That's a really great local example, but do you have some other examples of places that have done this?
I think one of the most extraordinary examples on the planet is what's going on in Kurdistan. So the Kurds are a very, very long oppressed ethnic group who live who are from originally the area in the northeast of Syria, the north of Iraq, the south of Turkey. When the British Empire kind of split up the Middle East and carved these borders out, as the Ottoman Empire collapsed, the Kurds were left without a state. And they've been horribly oppressed for a very long time. For decades, the Kurds were running effectively a Maoist revolutionary struggle, and they were failing. But not long ago, about a decade ago, one of their leaders discovered the writings of Murray Bookchin, who's an American anarchist, about municipal confederalism, and kind of said, we're not going to kind of put down our arms and stop struggling, but rather than fighting in order to create a state, what we should do is just start living into being our own autonomous nation. And they are doing it incredibly well. It's now known sometimes as Rojava, which simply means east, and sometimes as the autonomous administration of North and East Syria. They started with a handful of villages, and they are now, in an extraordinary grassroots manner, co-governing a multi-ethnic population of about 2 million people, in effectively, the most democratic confederation anywhere in that part of the world. It's run on the basis of grassroots assemblies of city blocks and town assemblies, essentially of 100 to 200 people each, who make most of the decisions, organise the rubbish collection, organise the school curricula, organise food distribution, and then they coordinate between those in regional councils with delegates sent from each of the local assemblies. And then there's a third tier of an assembly of the assemblies, which kind of does the large scale interconnection. But at every level, in every way, the power remains with the people on the ground. They're the ones who are making the decisions that affect their own lives. And because they're being so effective, they're living their lives better than pretty much anyone else in the countries that they're kind of part of still, Iraq and Syria primarily. They're living their lives so much better that community after community is seeking to join them and confederate with them in all sorts of ways. So I think that's just one of the most extraordinary examples in the world, where in the wreckage of a couple of failed states and deeply, horrifically autocratic governments, we're seeing a community simply live into being an incredible democratic nation.
And do you see Australia being able to follow along that, trajectory?
Look, I think Australia's trajectory necessarily will be completely different from that. but I think it can happen. There's been some extraordinary things going on elsewhere around the world. I talk in the book at length about Barcelona, which is more similar to Australia, of course, as a Western liberal democratic nation, where in Barcelona a grassroots commons-based government has been elected and is kind of doing a lot of work to distribute power out of City Hall and into the streets. Voices for India is another example. I think the grassroots Greens Party campaigns in Brisbane that won election to the lower house have done similar things with the community organising, but what they did as well is pair it with mutual aid, with flood recovery and all sorts of things in amazing ways. So yeah, it'll be different here because it's a different context and every ecosystem is different. But I think there are absolutely paths for us to find and to follow that will come from the specific challenges that we have here. I think housing is a prime example here, where the housing market is so utterly cooked that people are seeking to find different ways of providing for themselves through mutual aid. Food is likely to be a similar one for everyone. Different ways of coming together collectively to work out how we can house ourselves, how we can feed ourselves, and how we can govern ourselves. That's going to be the path.
For sure. Just around the corner from me, there's a restaurant that does like a mutual aid pop-up every week, which is pretty amazing to see. My last question, we are running a little bit over time. Sorry, folks, but my last question is, your book is about change. It's about putting people and the planet at the heart of, decision-making. It's about seeing democracy as an extension of all these different parts of our lives, how we interact with other people. But more importantly, it's about hope. I read the book and I came away as someone who is quite pessimistic. I came away from it feeling quite hopeful about the ability for us to turn things around. So what is, one final piece of advice for those of us in our audience, our community, who don't feel hopeful about the future?
One of the political philosophers I quote at length in the book is Antonio Gramsci, and one of his most famous lines is pessimism of the intellect, optimism of the will. We have to understand intellectually that, yep, things look pretty bad, but you have to also be optimistic through the will. And that's the thing for me. I didn't want to write a book about hope, I can't remember who initially said this word hopium, this idea that hope is a drug that we take to keep us going. It can't be that. It's got to be active. It's got to be active hope that comes from what we're doing. And I think we all know that in various ways, because activism is, everybody who's been involved kind of knows that that's the best antidote to depression about the state of the world, is just to get active. But it's also the best thing that we can do. So yeah, for me, it's about getting involved, and getting involved in a way that doesn't, some of the paths of activism that we're told to follow can actually be really disempowering, I think, is one of the important things that I tried to get to in the book. And as I said, starting off tonight, talking about the school strikers, building a mass movement, getting out into the streets, having these fantastic rallies, and then being told to bugger off, is really disempowering. But there are other forms of activism that are making our lives better, that are bringing people together, that are creating new paths. That's really empowering, incredibly empowering. And that, to me, is where the optimism lies.
Thanks, Tim. What you said really reminds me of something that was said on our last webinar by Sophie Scoms, and she said, action brings hope, and then acting together brings change. And I think that marries in really well with everything that you've said. So we are almost at time. A big thank you to you, Tim, for joining us. It was an absolute pleasure to read your book, and even more of a pleasure to have you on our Deep Dives webinar. The ideas that you talk about are something that got me really thinking deeply, and already starting to build democracy in my local community. And I know you've given our community lots to think about as well. So thank you very much. It's been wonderful to have our community join us for this deep dive conversation. And for the deep dives over the last 3 months. I've really loved having more time tonight in our breakouts to hear your inputs and your creativity in those rooms. But next month, we are going to be doing something a little bit different from deep dives. So in 2023, we have a really big opportunity to put political integrity reforms back at the top of the agenda and win some real change. We've spent the last few months getting a sense of our new government and their priorities, and we're working with other organisations in the Our Democracy Alliance on a new strategy. So we do want to launch this new phase of our campaign early in the new year and well before then. But before then, we want to hear from you. And as what Tim said, action is the antidote. It's what brings hope. So we want to get people acting. We want to get people together. And at our next webinar on December 14th, we're going to be sharing a bit of our strategy update, campaign update, and asking, for your thoughts and for your ideas and feedback on how we can make this campaign moment as impactful and empowering as possible. And this webinar is going to be a community campaign planning session. And I really hope you can all join us. Ash is going to share a link to the RSVP page. It's going to be an interactive one. So yeah, please RSVP the link in the chat. I know we've gone a few minutes over, but thank you very much for everyone who stuck around. Thank you, Tim, for being our guest speaker this evening.
Thanks so much for having me, Cheryl. And yeah, thanks everyone.